what are your thoughts using RPM squared with the Brazilian para team?
So one of our objectives to use RPM squared with the Brazilian Paralympic team is to use it for a readiness tool. So one of the project's goals is to reduce injury. So what we'd like to do is use RPM squared in some range of motion tests primarily to make sure that we're ready to train and we're symmetrical to train. It's also, we can use it as a self-check for our coaching and our planning and programming so that we can test prior, do our warm-up, and then test after, and make sure that we are correcting what our objectives are to correct, whether that be hip extension, hip flexion, and being symmetrical right to left. The reason we chose hip flexion for our readiness test, it's very specific to running. The hip engagement and the range of motion in the hip is vital to all phases of your running. So whether you're in your drive phase, acceleration phase, drive phase, transition phase, or top end, all of those muscles and that joint, specifically the hip joint, hip girdle, is paramount. So what we'd like to do is make sure that we can assess where you are prior to your warm-up. If there's a discrepancy between right and left, go into our dynamic warm-up, make sure that we've made those corrections by rechecking after our dynamic warm-up. The goal of using hip flexion specifically for our readiness test is to assess activation of all of the lumbopelvic muscles in stability, and then also to look at range of motion. Sprinters are notorious for having a lack of range of motion in their front, on their hip flexors and into the quads, simply because their front side mechanics are so strong, driving the knee up and then driving it back. So what we would like to do with this test specifically is to assess where you're at so we know exactly where to pinpoint your dynamic warm-up on, and then we can try to alleviate any of those asymmetries that we may find. One of our objectives is to help the coaches find a very efficient way to start their training. Not only efficient, but effective. So we need to pinpoint the specific movements or areas of opportunity to improve prior to training. So with RPM squared, we're using that so they know exactly what they need to pinpoint prior to practice. And then also that makes their practice or their dynamic warm-up or their pre-practice prep more efficient, because they know exactly what they need to pinpoint so that they're ready for their training.